Greetings, everybody. Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council. Welcome to another episode of GPS, Global Perspectives on Security. In this webcast, we look past the headlines. We try to dig a little bit deeper into the issues of the day to get a better understanding from experts about what is going on. And for well over a year, we've been talking to Mick Mulroy, our friend and colleague from the Lobo Institute. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer, and United States Marine. He's a national security analyst and co-founder of the Lobo Institute and a board member at the Plato Institute in Athens, Greece. Mick joins us again. Now, Mick, we have been talking well, it's been over a year. It's been 13, 14 months on Ukraine. I have to say, in all honesty, your views and your predictions have been extraordinarily accurate over this period about what is happening and what is coming next. I wonder if I could ask you to take a very brief look back at the milestones that we've crossed that were key to where we are today. Over to you.
Absolutely, Chris. So I think if you look back right before the Russians started their invasion, they were saying things like they're worried about NATO expansion on their border, things that actually weren't happening and actually didn't happen until they invaded. And now we're seeing Sweden and Finland request and will likely be admitted to NATO, two countries that managed to avoid, from their perspective, joining the entirety of the Cold War. We saw immediately that the Ukrainians defied the odds. Most intelligence services were predicting that Kyiv would fall within days, actually. It did not. It stood strong. I think the key milestone that I would say first was that, and how the training that the United States provided going back to 2014 in the key weapon systems. The first ones were the Javelins and the Stingers and a lot of these man-portable, really thwarted this Russian massive onslaught. And from there, the next key event, I think, would be the US really starting to provide artillery and all these really heavy weapons once they saw the Ukrainians could hold their own and actually defeat the Russians in engagements and then battles. And now I think the third phase we're about to enter into, if we elect to go that way, which is shifting from providing the Ukrainians just enough support so they can defend themselves to actually enough support so they can go on the offensive and potentially win, which that's kind of a loaded word, but certainly be able to push Russia out of the territory that it's gained since February last year, and potentially even getting into Crimea and really challenging their presence there.
So, Mick, since we spoke last, we've had the Munich Security Conference, and as you mentioned, there has been a number of pledges from NATO countries for increased armaments, tanks, and what have you. And immediately following that were calls for F-16s and other, heavier armaments, serious weapon systems. All, I think, pointed towards, as you say, this effort to not simply, defend themselves, but to win. So, Mick, now looking ahead a little bit, what would actually winning look like in military terms, given the situation on the ground?
So I think when it comes to the military contribution, then everything you just said, F-16s, A-10, those are attack fighter aircraft that are really good for close air support. ATACMS, which are long-range munitions that they can shoot out of their HIMARS system, which would really get them into Crimea and deep into the Russian supply lines. Those would give them the offensive power that they need alongside the tanks that you mentioned, the Bradley fighting vehicles, etc. So how does winning look? Well, I would say that if the Ukrainians can actually challenge Russian presence in Crimea, something they thought was a given, then it would potentially force Russia to the negotiation table, and we could see a negotiated settlement out of this that would cease hostilities. It's obviously up to the Ukrainians whether they cede any territory for the benefit of peace, or that they just keep pushing until they think they can recover all their territory. That's a Ukrainian decision there. One thing I would like to address, if it's okay, is all this talk about this being charity. I don't consider this charity at all. Every dollar we spent for the Ukrainians to fight Russians, in my mind, is worth $3 of our own national security. And what I mean by that is we're not fighting the Russians. That's one of our most significant adversaries. Ukrainians are, and they've depleted their combat power 50%. I mean, they've lost over 100,000 soldiers. That's almost double what we lost in Vietnam. That was 20 years. This was 1 year. This is not charity. This is Ukrainians fighting one of our most, I think, volatile adversaries and significantly degrading their capabilities.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Mick, actually, because obviously there's a very interesting domestic political debate. No surprise, coincidentally, it's coming at the time where people are announcing their intentions to run for the presidency. So, of course, it's caught up in American domestic politics, but there it is, because, of course, the government is beholden to the taxpayer, and the taxpayer is the voter, and there is a lot about this. On one hand, as you say, Mick, there is a broader and larger question strategically and geopolitically about this autocracy versus democracy, if you will, at its at its broadest sense. And that fight versus a kind of much smaller kind of squabble about munitions and what are we actually giving, and is it charity? As you say, President Zelensky was very clear when he addressed the joint houses that it's not charity. In fact, I mean his words, not mine. But I'm glad you raised that, because of course you and I will have to pick that up in another one of our discussions to see where is America at this. We've been talking a lot about on the ground in Ukraine. Mick, if I could just one last quick question, since it's come up, is this question about Chinese lethal munition to Russia. What kind of impact would that have on the situation in Ukraine?
So that's a very important question, Chris. That could have a significant impact. Right now, Russia is running short of essentially everything, including soldiers, but also being able to supply their troops on the front line. If China jumps in, they could create a steady stream of weapons, munitions, vehicles, aircraft, and parts, replacement parts, that would really help the Russians and obviously really hurt the Ukrainians. We need to do everything we can to keep China out of this. And if they do, we need to be prepared to sanction them and essentially tell them they own everything that the Russians are doing in Ukraine, which is a massive amount of war crime. So we need to do everything we can diplomatically to keep China out of it. That would have a very negative impact on Ukrainians and, of course, their supporters, which is the US and NATO.
Well, despite some American politicians saying otherwise, I think the general view is that the United States diplomacy has functioned quite well in this situation, in an incredibly complex and complicated situation requiring, large scale, very subtle diplomacy to maintain this coalition against the aggression in Ukraine. And so let us hope actually that those possibilities for peace emerge for everybody's sake. So let me say thanks again to Mick Mulroy, our friend and partner from the Lobo Institute, for lending his expertise on the situation in Ukraine 1 year after the war. Thanks also to the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank, who help us bring this and so many more programs to you. Mick, until we talk again, thank you very much. Be well. Bye-bye.